In the 1980s, two groups were looking at the same passenger forecasts. Traffic was climbing, terminals were filling up, and everyone agreed airports had to earn more. One group said the money was out on the runway. Charge the airlines properly. The aircraft is the customer. The other group said the aircraft was never the customer at all. Rebuild the terminal around the person walking through it. Both sides committed billions in construction debt to their answer, and the fee a landing actually generates is still quoted in dollars per 1,000 pounds of aircraft weight. That detail decided everything. Start with the invoice. When an aircraft lands at a commercial airport in the United States, the airline is billed under a formula that has nothing to do with how many people were on board. The unit is weight. Landing fees are quoted in dollars per 1,000 pounds of maximum gross landing weight, and the airline pays the same whether the cabin was full or nearly empty. That single design choice tells you what the fee was built to do. It is not a price. A price is what you charge when you are trying to make money. This is a cost recovery mechanism, and it was engineered that way on purpose. Federal law is explicit about it. Any airport that has accepted federal grant money, which is nearly every airport of consequence in the country, agrees to a set of binding conditions in exchange. Two of them matter here. The fees charged to aircraft operators must be reasonable and tied to the cost of providing the service, and the revenue those fees generate cannot leave the airport. That second condition is called the prohibition on revenue diversion, and it is the reason this story exists. A city cannot run its airport at a healthy margin and move the surplus into the general fund to fix roads. The money stays inside the fence. Congress tightened the language in 1982 and tightened it again in 1994, and the FAA has been enforcing it ever since. So when you ask what an airport makes on a landing, you are asking a question the law has already answered. On the aeronautical side, the target is break even, not thin margin. Break even. An airport that consistently profited on landing fees would be inviting a federal investigation. The formula itself is entirely public. Take the aircraft's certificated maximum landing weight, divide by 1,000, multiply by the published rate, and that is the bill. A wide body pays several times what a regional jet pays because it weighs several times as much, not because it carries several times as many people. Two flights leaving the same gate an hour apart, one full and one half empty, generate identical landing revenue. Airlines understood this better than the airports did. Under the long-term use and lease agreements signed at most large hubs, the carriers are not simply customers. They are parties to the cost formula. In what is called a residual model, the signatory airlines agree to cover whatever shortfall remains after all other revenue is counted. It sounds like generosity. It is the opposite. Because if the airlines are underwriting the bottom line, they expect influence over what gets built on top of it. That arrangement has consequences. For now, the relevant part is simpler. The airport is protected from loss and prevented from gain by the same clause. Here is where two airports with almost identical traffic end up in completely different financial positions. Take two hubs of comparable size, similar movement counts, similar passenger volumes, and similar runway configurations. One operates under that residual agreement. The other uses what is called a compensatory model, where the airport charges for the facilities it provides and keeps whatever it earns beyond that. Same aircraft, same passengers, same weather, completely different balance sheets. The variable was never the number of flights. It was the paperwork underneath them. Two airports can post the same movement count on the same day and record entirely different results, and neither one of them has any say over which model they inherited. It was decided when the bonds were issued. Airports knew the aeronautical side was capped, and in 1990 they went to Congress for relief. What they got was the passenger facility charge, a fee added to each ticket and collected by the airline on the airport's behalf. It was authorized at a maximum of $3. The cap was written in from the first day. 10 years later, the cap moved to $4.50. That was in 2000. It has not moved since. Construction costs have roughly doubled. Terminal projects that cost hundreds of millions in 2000 cost billions now. The ceiling has not been raised in over 20 years, and every attempt to raise it has been fought by the airlines, who would rather the money went through their own agreements than around them. So the picture from the runway looks like this. Fees the airport is not allowed to profit on. A ticket surcharge frozen for a generation. A contract that ties the airport's fortunes to the carriers it is billing. And underneath all of it, fixed costs that do not care whether anyone lands at all. None of which meant the airports were poor. It meant the money had to come from somewhere the law did not restrict. And by the 1970s, a few operators had started looking at the space between the security checkpoint and the gate. There were shops in there already. Newsstands, coffee counters, a bar or two. Nobody thought of them as a business line. They were amenities, and they were leased the way amenities get leased. Flat rent. A fixed sum per square foot per year, signed for a long term, indexed to nothing. The operator paid the same rent in a record year as in a terrible one. If a newsstand tripled its sales because the airport had just opened a new concourse and doubled its traffic, the airport captured none of it, which is a strange way to run a property you own outright. The airport built the terminal, financed it with bonds, paid the debt service, delivered the customers to the door, and then took a fixed check regardless of what happened inside. That is not a lease. That is a subsidy. The early attempts to fix it did not work. Airports that tried to renegotiate found the leases were airtight and had decades left to run. Some tried to raise rents at renewal and watch the tenants walk. Others brought concessions in-house, ran them with airport staff, and discovered that municipal authorities are not good at retail. Sales fell, complaints rose. The experiment did not last long, so the constraint was understood, and the obvious fixes had failed. The runway could not make money by law. The terminal was making money for somebody else by contract. What nobody had done yet was ask why the passenger was standing in that terminal for so long in the first place, or whether that was something an airport could control. Nobody was measuring it. There was no line on any budget for how long someone waited. The answer came out of London, and it came because the ownership changed. The British Airports Authority had been a state body since 1966. Under the Airports Act, 1986, it was converted into a company and floated on the London Stock Exchange in July 1987, carrying Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, and 4 others with it. For the first time, an operator of major airports had shareholders who expected a return. Those shareholders ran into the same wall the Americans had. The charges Heathrow and Gatwick could levy on aircraft were capped by the Civil Aviation Authority under a formula tied to inflation minus a set efficiency factor. The regulator reviewed it every 5 years. There was no version of that arrangement in which the runway generated a growing profit. Worse, under the system British regulators used, commercial income was counted when the aeronautical cap was set. Money made in the shops effectively pushed the landing charges down. Retail success at Heathrow was partly handed back to the airlines in the form of lower fees, which is a strange incentive to give a listed company and a real one. So the pressure went somewhere else. If the regulated side was fixed and the commercial side was the only variable, the commercial side had to stop being run like a collection of amenities. The fix was a contract structure, and it is unglamorous. Concession agreements were rewritten around 2 numbers instead of 1. The tenant commits to a minimum annual guarantee, a floor the airport receives regardless of performance. On top of that, the airport takes a percentage of gross sales above a threshold. The floor protects the landlord in a bad year. The percentage captures the upside in a good one. That single change rewired the relationship. Under flat rent, the airport was indifferent to what happened inside the unit. Under a percentage of sales, every additional pound spent at a perfume counter in Terminal 3 partly belonged to the operator of the building. The airport was now a shareholder in its own tenants. And once you own a share of sales, you start measuring the thing that produces them. That thing turned out to be time. The metric is dwell time, and it is exactly what it sounds like. How long a passenger spends inside the terminal after clearing security and before boarding. Retailers had understood the correlation for years. Airports had never had a financial reason to care. Now they did, and the number was measurable, and it responded to design. What followed was not subtle. Check-in and security were pushed as early in the journey as possible, which encouraged passengers to arrive with margin. Departure lounges were consolidated so that gate information was withheld until closer to boarding, keeping people in the central area rather than dispersed along a pier. In new terminals, the walk from security to the gates was routed through the retail floor rather than around it. Seating in shopping zones was kept deliberately sparse. None of this was framed publicly as commercial engineering. It was described as passenger experience, and some of it genuinely was. But the layouts optimized for one variable, and the variable was minutes. The flight had quietly become the delivery mechanism. The terminal was the business. And while airports were rediscovering retail, the largest single earner at most American airports was sitting outside the building doing almost nothing. Parking. Consider what a parking structure actually is. It is a piece of land the airport already owns, poured in concrete, financed once, with no inventory, no supply chain, no seasonal buying, and a staffing requirement close to zero once the barriers are automated. It does not spoil. It cannot be discounted by a competitor across the street, because at most airports there is no competitor across the street. At many large U.S. airports, parking and ground transportation have consistently ranked as the biggest non-aeronautical line, ahead of terminal concessions. It is unglamorous, it appears in no press release, and it has margins that no shop in the terminal can approach. A passenger who parks for 6 days generates more for the airport than a passenger who buys a sandwich, and the airport spends nothing to serve them. So the commercial side was compounding. The aeronautical side, meanwhile, was going the other way, and the reason was concentration. At a hub airport, one carrier typically holds an overwhelming share of the movements. 50% is common. 60 or 70% is not unusual. That airline is not one customer among many. It is the airport, in any practical sense, and both parties know it. The leverage appears in the lease. Most large use and lease agreements contain what are called majority and interest clauses. They give the signatory airlines, weighted by their share of traffic and landed weight, the right to review and in many cases block major capital projects at the airport. A new concourse, a runway extension, a terminal replacement. If the dominant carrier does not want it, it does not get built, or it gets deferred until the agreement expires. The logic is defensible on paper. The airlines are underwriting the costs, so they get a say in what costs are incurred. In practice, it means an airport that wants to expand must first persuade the company with the least interest in seeing a competitor get gate space. And the airport cannot simply wait it out, because its costs do not pause. Terminals are financed with revenue bonds, usually over 20 or 30 years. The debt service is due whether traffic rises or falls. Runway maintenance, air traffic infrastructure, snow removal equipment, the fire service required by regulation, the security perimeter, all of it is fixed. An airport with half its normal flights does not have half its normal costs. It has nearly all of them. That asymmetry is the whole problem. Revenue on the aeronautical side moves with movements. Costs do not move at all. And under a residual agreement, the airlines that cover the shortfall have every reason to keep the capital budget small and every contractual tool to do it. By the late 1990s, a large hub was running two businesses that pointed in opposite directions. One was capped by law, constrained by contract, and dominated by a single counterparty with veto rights. The other was a retail and property operation with no ceiling on it at all. Nobody had yet said out loud which one was subsidizing the other. That admission was still a few years away, and when it came from the small airports. The small airports said it first because they had no choice. A regional field with 2 daily flights has the same fire cover requirement, the same runway to maintain, the same security perimeter as a hub, and almost nobody walking past a shop. The only way that arithmetic works is more passengers, and the only way to get more passengers is to persuade an airline to come. By the late 1990s, the low-cost carriers understood exactly how weak that position was. Ryanair, EasyJet, and their imitators arrived at secondary airports across Europe with a proposition that inverted the entire relationship. We will bring you 1 million passengers a year. Here is what it will cost you. The packages had a recognizable shape. Landing fees waived or cut to a fraction of the published rate. ground handling at a fixed low price, a marketing contribution paid by the airport to the airline, and in the most aggressive versions, a payment per departing passenger flowing from the airport to the carrier. Read that again. The airport pays the airline to land. It became undeniable in 2004. The European Commission ruled that the arrangement between Ryanair and Brussels South Charleroi Airport, a facility controlled by the Walloon region, constituted unlawful state aid in part, and ordered a portion of the benefits recovered. Ryanair appealed. In 2008, the General Court annulled the decision, largely on the grounds that the Commission had wrongly separated the region's role as public authority from its role as airport owner. The case ran on for years afterwards. The legal outcome mattered less than what the file exposed. Every term was now public. Everyone in the industry could see the actual price of an aircraft movement at a small airport, and the actual price was negative, which reframes the question the whole story started with. What does an airport make per flight? At a secondary field competing for service, the honest answer is a loss. The flight is not revenue, it is customer acquisition cost, and it is paid up front. Now the scoreboard. Airports Council International reports airport revenue in two categories, aeronautical and non-aeronautical, and globally the non-aeronautical share has run at roughly 40% of total industry revenue in recent years, higher at commercially aggressive operators and lower at those constrained by regulation. That is revenue, not profit. On profit, the gap is far wider because the aeronautical side is running at cost recovery by design, while the retail and parking side is not. Sir John Egan, who ran BAA through the 1990s, was direct about what the company had become. He described the business as retailing, with the aircraft as the means of delivering shoppers to the door. Coming from the chief executive of the operator of Heathrow, that is not a metaphor. That is a description of the balance sheet. So the second group was right. The flight was never the product. The passenger was, and the terminal was the store. And then the model that won nearly destroyed the people who had committed to it hardest. In 2020, passenger traffic collapsed. Global airport revenue fell by well over half in a single year. But the collapse was not evenly distributed, and the reason is precisely what had made the retail model attractive. Non-aeronautical revenue is passenger elastic. It exists only when people are physically inside the building with time to spend. When traffic falls 90%, duty-free income falls 90%, food and beverage falls with it, and parking, that flawless machine with no inventory and no staffing, earns almost nothing because empty spaces cannot be discounted into demand. The aeronautical side fell too, but under a residual agreement, the shortfall is contractually recoverable from the signatory airlines. The rates go up. The mechanism that had capped the upside for 40 years also placed a floor under the downside. Airports with the highest commercial share and the most privatized structures took the hardest hit. Some of the most heavily regulated, most airline-dependent operators, the ones that had looked financially unimaginative for a generation, absorbed the shock with the least damage. Heathrow, the flagship of the retail model, reported a loss of about £2 billion in 2020 and did not return to profit for years. Airports still operating under cost recovery agreements were unpleasant places to work that year, but their revenue formula still functioned. So the answer to the question, stated plainly, at a large hub, a single flight produces a landing fee measured in the low thousands of dollars, calculated on weight, structured to recover cost and legally barred from producing profit. At a secondary airport competing for service, it produces less than nothing. The money arrives afterwards, from the passengers walking off the aircraft, and it arrives through parking gates and concession percentages that have no connection to aviation at all. The airport does not sell flights. It buys them and then sells everything that happens next. The regulated model looked like a failure for 40 years and turned out to be insurance. The commercial model looked like genius for 40 years and turned out to be leverage. Neither group was stupid. They were reading the same passenger forecasts and weighting different risks, and the risk that eventually mattered was not on anyone's forecast. Although there is one more part of this. When the airlines and the airports sat down after 2020 to renegotiate the agreements that had governed this relationship since the 1990s, what was actually demanded behind closed doors changed the terms for the next generation of terminals. But that is for another video.